In the past on Conversations, we've brought you people who can tell you all about the intimate details of the lives of all kinds of creatures, the beasts of the earth and the sky and the oceans. Sharks, snow leopards, Tibetan eagles, whales, snakes. Well, today, it's snails. Yes, snails. Some people find them slightly revolting. Some people find them edible. But my guest today will make you understand that snails are fascinating. How fascinating? Well, for a start, they have teeth. 15,000 tiny, tiny teeth. And when they have sex, they can impregnate each other at the same time because they're hermaphrodites. And some of them can grow as big as a foot. They're slow-moving and squishy, and their shell is brittle, so it's amazing that they've endured all these countless thousands of years. Dr. John Stanisic is a scientist who's made Australian land snails his life's work. John is known amongst his colleagues as the Snail Whisperer, and John was the lead author of Australian Land Snails Volume 1, a field guide to eastern Australian species. And I spoke to him in 2014. Hello, John.
Hello, Richard.
This is a big book, and it's just Volume 1.
It's a field guide.
It's a big heavy... I'm just going to drop it so you can hear it.
Do you need a gun bearer to bring it with you?
That tends to suggest to me that since that's Volume 1, there are a lot of different snails. Have you got a ballpark figure on how many different snail species there are in Australia?
In Australia, native species, probably 2,500 to 3,000. Worldwide, there's about 30,000, 40,000 maybe. And they're all living in a native forest, doing the right thing by the environment, and yeah.
Let's just knock one little myth over the head. When most Australians think of snails, they think of the common garden snail that's there, that chews our lettuce and whatever. Are they native or introduced?
No, they're introduced from Europe very early on. They're recorded in the 1850s, actually. They were brought in basically on plants because they lay their eggs in the soil. So when people came across and brought plants with them from overseas, they would have brought snail eggs with them. And most people's perception of snails is about these introduced things that live in their garden, chew their vegetables up. And we've got about 60 or so introduced species in Australia, and these include the slugs as well. And I'd just like to make the point that slugs are just snails without shells.
Right. Which came first, the slug or the snail? Did the shell evolve later, or
no? The shell had to come first because it enabled the snails to move from the marine environment to the land environment because they had a shell that protected them from desiccation, and also the early inhabitants had a little operculum, much like the marine snails have now, to lock themselves away from any predators.
So most, the snail shell on a snail looks a lot like a mollusk, like a sea mollusk. I mean, this is maybe a really silly question, but are they related?
Well, they are way back. They are all mollusks, but land snails have moved on. Land snails evolved way back in the Carboniferous period, which is about 220 million years ago. Not that you can imagine that in your mind, but that's when the snails evolved, so the land snails. And the freshwater ones we have actually evolved from the land snails. They was a secondary invasion of the freshwaters by the land.
How many snails, Australian land snails, have you been able to discover and name, John?
Oh, an estimate. We've probably discovered about, I say we, because there's myself and my assistant for many years, Daryl Potter. We probably discovered about 900 new species.
900.
Yeah.
And then you get to name them as a result.
Yeah, we named about 300 in the first volume, but because you can only fit so much into a book, and that's already heavy enough, we still got about 600 species in the museum collections which haven't got names.
How do you decide to name them anyway? Where do you get the names from?
Well, you really try and name them on something, a character that's on the shell, for example, to enable people to associate the name with the shell. And it's all done in Latin. It's a binomial name. You have a genus name and a species name.
Ever picked any celebrity names, though?
Well, sometimes that's not possible. So you name it after the locality, you might name it after a friend, colleague, or you may name it after somebody who's famous. For example, I named the snail after Steve Irwin years ago, just after he was killed by that stingray, mainly because it had little khaki bands all around it, and I couldn't think of anything better than to name this after Steve. Another thing that we named after Peter Brock, for example, we had this really fast semi-slug. A semi-slug is just a snail with a reduced, very tiny shell, and it had like GT stripes down the side of its body. So,
the snail was fast enough to be named after Peter Brock. So, what have you called it? Peter Brock Eye or something?
Peter Brock Eye, yeah.
Why are snails important? What are Australian land snails? What role do they play in the broader
Well,
environment?
they're part of terrestrial diversity, and when terrestrial diversity, animal diversity, is 99% invertebrate. That's all the insects and crustaceans, and the snails are about 6% of that diversity. And they're very important in the decomposition process in the forests. They eat decaying. Unlike the introduced species, which eat green vegetable matter, native species are basically decomposition feeders, feed on detritus, biofilm that grows on trees, on leaves, and they're important in keeping the leaves, for example, free of a lot of detritus that might form on the leaves of trees. And so they contribute a lot to keeping our forests in a natural sort of state, as do a lot of the other small creatures that we don't hear too much about in the world. And they re-nutrify soils through their decaying bodies, decaying shells, providing calcium to the soils. And they also a food source for a number of other animals, such as lizards.
And birds as well. Birds eat snails.
Birds, and there is one bird in particular that is quite famous for it, the pitta bird.
How does that eat a snail?
It's a very colourful bird that lives on the rainforest floor. And it actually seeks out snails, picks them up, and goes to a little rock which it has in the rainforest, and we call it an anvil. And it bangs, bang, 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 smashes the shell till it breaks, and then sucks out the animal. So if you find one of these in the rainforest, you usually find a whole lot of scattered, broken shells.
What's the difference between land snails and sea snails? Obviously, apart from the environment, structurally, how are they different from each other?
Well, they all follow a basic plan. I mean, the marine snails, a lot of them, the majority are separate sexes, so you have males and females. But when you come to the land snails, about 90% of them are hermaphrodites, so they're both male and female.
And do they have some way of protecting themselves against the intrusion of seawater once you get into the sea? Do they sort of plug themselves up? Is that how it works?
Oh, well, all the sea snails have a percola, little doors that some of the land snails also have these, but the main reason for these are to protect against predators, not against the seawater, of course, because they rely on the seawater to provide oxygen, which they extract from the water by means of a gill. Whereas the land snails, majority, 95% of them, have a lung.
How big can a land snail get?
Well, we have the biggest one that we know of that actually has intruded Australia is the giant African snail, which was introduced into the Pacific area during the war by the Japanese as a sort of extra food source for soldiers.
Really?
And it's a very big snail. It grows to about a foot long, the animal. 30 centimetres in the new scale, I suppose. But it's not the biggest snail. The giant African snail, the giantest African snail, is actually a much bigger snail, which, fortunately for us, has not made it out of Africa. But the giant African snail is very important as a pest species, significant, as a pest species, because it has 500 different vegetables and plants on its diet. So it got into a country like Australia, which is so agriculturally based, it would be a disaster.
You brought in a kind of a terrarium of different Australian snails with you, and we took some photos of that, which will be up on our Facebook page a bit later on. And it was funny because they're really quite beautiful, these snails you've brought in. They're the native Australian ones. They've got beautiful balls on them, on their shells. It's funny watching one of my producers talking to them like a cat or something, saying, "Oh, aren't you a darling, aren't you?" Do you feel affection for snails sometimes?
Well, I do. I have this sort of moniker, the snail whisperer, not because I so much whisper the snails, but I know a lot about their intricacies of their lifestyles. And one of my great passions is the conservation of snails. We are losing a lot of species because one of the great threats to snails is habitat destruction. And a lot of snails have very restricted distributions, like they might only be in a 50-kilometre area radius. And when you destroy, like vine thicket patches in the brigalow country, for example, with these tiny patches of dry rainforest in amongst the brigalow, mostly regarded as sort of horrible scrub by most people, yet they are the homes of a lot of species of snails and other invertebrates. And I gather that, well, my reading of it is that over the years we must have lost, many, many species, probably into the hundreds, as a result of them being cleared for, say, farming in the first instance, and now mining.
When you're looking at a snail shell, what does that shell tell you about the snail?
Well, with the huge amount of diversity in shell shape, I mean, you've got to see a collection of snails. They range for anywhere from 1.5 millimetres in size to the giant panda snail, which is over 7 centimetres in shell diameter. They have different patterns of banding. They have different sculptural patterns on the shell. And these are all things that you look at and you say, well, that's this species or that species. But I'm always amazed at when I find a new species, there's always something different about it. And a lot of these things are only viewed by, say, electron microscopy, but when you do, the patterns of sculpture are just so intricate and complex, you just wonder why.
There's some shells right in front of me you've brought in these different cartons, and there's a little tray there of these really beautiful, pointed, glossy green, sort of like electric leaf green snail shells. Where are they from?
They're from Manus Island, and they're actually protected now by international law, and so you can't collect them. I mean, in the early days, they were collected in huge numbers, I mean, to the point where they're becoming extinct. So legislation was introduced to protect them, and anyone caught with them will be probably fined.
They seem really fragile, the shells of snails. Do they give effective protection against predators?
A lot of them do. They're very hardy. I mean, they look fragile, but they're not. The common garden snail, which is introduced, has probably got one of the most fragile shells of any snail in Australia. Most Australian snails have fairly robust shells, but when you get down to the really tiny ones, yes, they're predated on by beetles, for example, and the beetles can actually crack the shell.
Is it significant that some snail shells curl one way and others go the other way? It's like water going down the drain in different directions. Does that mean anything to them?
Probably not. It's just a genetic thing. But most Australian snails, native species, are what we call right-hand coiled or dextral, which means that when you hold them up with the opening of the snail pointing towards you and the top of the snail pointing upwards, and I make that point not because it's trivialised, but a lot of people don't realise that. You point it upwards. And the opening is on the right-hand side. That's the right-hand coiled snail. Now, sometimes, in a few instances, we get left-hand coiled snails. Sometimes we get, and as a species, sometimes we get mutations in a population where it becomes left-handed. But because that also changes the position of the reproductive system, those mutations don't get bred through the
they can't mate with them then?
They can't.
You mentioned there that they have, I mentioned them, how they have teeth, these little thousands of little tiny teeth. Do they sort of grind their food like sandpaper?
They scrape, and some actually penetrate plant cells, like algae, for example. They have dagger-like teeth, and then the carnivorous ones, for example, really have dagger-like teeth.
Carnivorous ones? There are carnivorous snails?
Sometimes called cannibal snails, actually.
What do they eat?
A whole raft of things, including themselves. As we found out early on in our collecting career, we put 2 or 3 of these species, kept them separate from other snails because we knew they ate other snails, into a container, and then at night go to get them out and preserve them, and you find there's 1 snail and 2 empty shells.
Do they eat animals?
They eat earthworms and other invertebrates, yeah.
Gee, just as well they're small and slow moving, isn't it? 15,000 teeth and carnivorous.
Oh, but, the teeth are incredibly small. I mean, you need a microscope to see them.
Have you seen a snail eat another snail?
Yeah, I had an experience down on the down around Kempsey and one of my collecting trips where it was just raining for 3 days and I couldn't get to the site that I wanted to get to, so I had this little thing going on the camping table, I put a carnivorous species together with an Asian tramp snail, which is an introduced species widespread in eastern Australia. And I just thought, well, I'll just see how long it takes this snail to actually demolish the Asian snail. And within about 3/4 of an hour, it'll rip. And I got a sequence of photos, which is just terrific, actually, in terms of life in the undergrowth, because it's tearing sinews of, it's awful.
You got to post that on YouTube. I actually would want to see that, I think.
It's a pity it's not a video, but I mean, it's a sequence of shots.
Now, they're called gastropods. Now, pod being foot, gastro being stomach. Does that mean the stomach's in the foot? Is that what it means?
Well, basically, the stomach sits on top. The whole visceral mass, as we call it, sits on top of the foot.
And the mouth is on the foot, right?
Yeah, the mouth is at the front of the foot.
Right. And so if you're going to watch them devour something, you have to sort of look at it from underneath, in other words.
No. The carnivores have very long necks, okay? So you're just watching them tearing the snail limb from limb, basically.
Snail carnage here.
It is. No, you jest, but I wouldn't.
I'm going to ask, this is another really silly question, but those long stalks, those uppermost long stalks that snails have, are they its eyes?
The eyes are at the top of the top pair of tentacles. They usually have 2 pairs of tentacles, and the eyes are at the top of the top pair of tentacles, but they're very limited in what they can see, and it's very fuzzy, their vision. They rely heavily on chemotaction, like detecting chemicals, smells, for example.
So they smell their way through the world.
Yep.
And the mucus that they secrete, the slime, the snail trail that they secrete, what's that for?
That's to actually crawl on, because the snails won't crawl on just bare ground. They all secrete a slime trail, just some are more visible than others, and the slime trail is produced by a set of mucus cells at the front of the foot, and it lays this down basically like laying down an asphalt highway, and it just crawls across this.
Makes its own highway as it moves along. Does that have anything to do with that line from Apocalypse Now, where Brando, as Colonel Kurtz, is saying, "I saw a snail crawl along the edge of a straight razor"? Is such a thing possible? And do you see? And does the mucus protect them from that?
No,
that's just
no. That's a bit of very
fanciful,
stuff.
Is it? Okay, all right. Just thought I had to check that. Are they born with their shells?
Part of the shell, the first 1.5 whorls or volutions of the shell are actually produced inside the egg. I mean, snails do lay eggs, produced inside the egg. So when they hatch, the little baby snail has an actual home to already crawl into. But at a very young age, there's a lot of mortality with snails because they are so small and so vulnerable to drying. So, although snails may lay a lot of eggs, there's only a few that actually grow to be adulthood.
So given that they're so squishy and they're secreting, fluid all the time, they must be drinking all the time or taking in moisture somehow.
They're described as a leaky water bag by some people. And when they're actually active, there are 2 types of mucus. The one is the mucus they crawl on, and there is the other mucus that keeps the body moist. And when they're active, and this came to light when we were actually doing some shooting for the Catalyst program of this snail. That was a giant panda snail, and we had it going for about 3/4 of an hour. But as snails are active, they're continually secreting mucus and so losing liquid, and they have to then revitalise themselves after a period of time.
So where do they get the moisture from?
From the food that they eat, or they drink water. I mean, in my terraria, they keep the snails in. I always have a little bowl of water for them and you often go down at night and you'll see them sort of, having a dip.
Do they breathe? Do they have lungs?
They have lungs. The majority, these are the pulmonates, or what we call the lung breathers. They have lungs. And then the ones that still have the operculum, of which we have about 100 species in eastern Australia, they have a rudimentary sort of gill system. But the lung breathers are, the majority of the species.
Given that they need so much moisture, they obviously wouldn't be found anywhere in the desert, for example, then. Or are they?
They are, provided they have the microhabitat to exist. So you can go into Central Australia, for example, where you wouldn't think you would find a lot of snails. But if you get a rock outcrop, for example, hidey holes for snails, also rock outcrops tend to act like moisture sinks and conserve moisture, and snails are able to crawl, because of their fairly malleable body, are able to crawl down in the deepest holes in these rock piles. So we have a huge Central Australian fauna.
How do they survive long dry periods?
We call it aestivation in snail world. It's a form of hibernation, and they either secrete a calcium plug across their opening, their aperture, or they just seal very tightly to a rock or a log, and they can live like that for months at a time.
Well, they just wait for it to rain, in other words.
To wait for it to rain. And it's estimated that in the Sonora Desert, in America, for example, snails may aestivate up to 10 years in between rainstorms. Yeah. And even in northern Australia, where you get truncated monsoons that may only last 3 weeks, snails will have to aestivate for 9 months of the year.
And when they do they just sort of go plop back out again, do they? Is that what happens?
Yeah, and they will actually percolate up or make their way up through these rock piles. And because as it gets drier, the snail might actually move further and further down the rock pile and into these crevices. And when it starts to rain and the water trickles down, the snail is activated and it'll come up and feed, and all its reproductive organs of greater maturity, mate, and then lay eggs, and then retreat back down into the rock pile, all in the space of a couple of weeks.
So if people have ever picked up like a snail shell thinking they've just got a pretty shell from a dead animal and brought it back home and then have it sort of go plop and pop back into life again, I wonder.
Well, this has happened on a number of occasions with a giant African snail, and actually with a snail from New Caledonia, which is just as large as the giant African snail, was found outside the Treasury Casino garden, for example. People collect them, and the snail is withdrawn right up into the shell, the top of the shell, so they figure, it's a nice shell to bring back, and they put it in their luggage, and somewhere along the line this thing is activated and starts crawling around, and they try and do the right thing. Instead of just throwing it in the garbage, they say, let's put it in the garden somewhere, not knowing, of course, that if it's a giant African snail, they're probably doing the wrong thing, but they'll put it in the garden, and that's, yeah.
I'm conscious of how vulnerable they are. I mean, they're squishy, they're incredibly slow-moving, they're obviously good targets for predators. Why are there slugs in the world, then? If the one protective thing they seem to have seems to be their shell, why would they be moving away and evolving away from... Where's the sense of natural selection?
A good question. Well, to quote Malcolm Fraser, life was meant to be easy. If you don't have to take calcium out of your food, and for the shell, for example, that requires a lot of energy, you can put that energy into other aspects of your life, and it might be a mating or egg laying, produce more eggs, for example. But there have been a number of what we call evolutionary experiments of things becoming slugs, and the slugs are all produced by different snail groups, shell groups. And so there are a lot of slugs around the world.
Because there are some animals, aren't they, that have the survival strategy or reproduction strategy is to have few young and spend a lot of attention and look after them, but snails are just the opposite, are they? They have lots and lots of young, and
they don't look after them. They just lay the eggs and move off.
They take off, do they? Not much love in the snail world, is there? So given that they are so slow-moving, how is it they've endured? How is it the snails are still with us, and why have they not become completely extinct?
Well, they're great survivors on the land, and having a little portable home that you can take around with you from place to place, I mean, is a huge advantage. I mean, even humans can't do that too well.
Garden snails that we have, they're European, so I'm assuming they're like the edible snails that are...
They are escargot.
They are escargot.
And I might explain later as to how you can just have your own escargot meal if you have garden snails.
I'd love to hear that. Now tell me now.
Just collect them and feed them on dry bran for a week to let them clean themselves out in case they've been feeding on some noxious weed, for example.
Dry bran, right?
Yeah, and then you throw them in the boiling water.
With the shell?
With the shell. Boil them for a while. And then you take them out of the shell and you can just fry them in garlic or whatever. And
garlic and butter and away you go.
Yeah, and a bit of wine, red wine. And
delightful?
They are.
But what about Australian snails? Are they edible?
No. Well, they are probably, but they don't produce a good product for the table. They really come up as a black blob when you start to cook them because the food they eat they are not as, how should I say, as meaty as the European snails.
Are they toxic in any way?
No. We had a French chef out here years ago on a grant, and we actually provided a huge number of native species, and his only comment was a black blob.
Black blob. I can't eat that.
Conversations with Richard Fidler. Broadcast, podcast, and online.
How did you spend time as a kid? Were you out and about in the natural world as a kid quite a bit?
Well, I was, actually. I was always fascinated by the Australian bush, I must say, and the neighbours, actually, the people across the road had young children, and one of them, Graham Wells, he was also a very good natural history collector. He collected butterflies and all birds' eggs, and I became interested in doing the same thing. And on Saturday mornings, I would just disappear down to a place called Potts Park, which is now and there was a patch of native bush down there. Unfortunately, there's now a greyhound training track. And collect bird eggs, butterflies, just observe, fossick, collect rocks. I collected all sorts of things, stamps, coins. I always had a problem with my parents because they could never see any point in what I was doing.
Really? Why? What did they want for you?
No, well, they wanted me to be successful in life, and they couldn't see that natural history, and particularly snails later on, would pay my existence.
Right, there's not millions in snails?
No. Well, there isn't, actually. No. I'm not a millionaire.
No.
And it was always against this background that I found this fascination, because I'd always get down to the bush early, and that I always have to be back by lunchtime, etc. But I was just totally fascinated. And at school, not so much at school, but when I went to university, I became more interested in biology than what my father wanted me to do, which was industrial chemistry. I did one term of industrial chemistry, and reading heat flow diagrams just was not for me.
Right. Biodiversity science smells a lot better, I'm guessing, than industrial chemistry.
We had this incredible bank of lecturers in second year university who were totally inspirational, and foremost amongst them was a bloke called Dr. John Rasek, a Czechoslovakian, whose passion was freshwater sponges and prawns. He was the father of the Australian prawning industry, but he also did some field guides to freshwater sponges of Australia. Not much future in that, because there's only about 28, 30 species. But nonetheless, he had this, when I did invertebrate zoology, which is what the start was in my biological career, he ran lecturers in first or second term, I think it was, and he spent all lunchtime putting these marvellous coloured chalk drawings up of the various animals that we covered from lecture to lecture, and I was just amazed. And then he just dropped them off straight after the lecture, and I went, they're masterpieces, you can't do that.
Yeah. So this is where you sort of said, so then for you, it's a beautiful thing. Then it's a beauty. It's an issue of beauty.
And I had never been on a field trip before that year, and we went on our first field trip to Smiths Lake, which is in central New South Wales near Forster, and I really got a feel for just being out in the open amongst a good team of biologists. And I really said at that moment that this is a career I want, because there were a whole heap of lecturers there as well, and they were just like really great people, and and I went from there.
One of your colleagues, Tim Lowe, was on the program talking about birds, and one of the things he was saying was that one thing he doesn't understand is that he sees, because he has the knowledge, because he's a scientist, he sees all these dramas going on in the natural world around us every day, even in the suburbs, particularly in the suburbs. He sees it's going on, and he doesn't understand why the rest of us just don't see it. We don't see it. There's all this stuff going on, and we walk right past it. It's sort of there right in front of us, almost right in front of our eyes, but we still don't see it. Do you feel the same way?
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of people look, but they don't observe the finer things. I mean, I can walk through a forest and see all sorts of different animals with people, and it would take, I have to point it out and say, have a look at that, have a look at that. And it's a failing, I think. I've run biodiversity sort of projects with school kids, primary kids, and they're absolutely fascinated. I really think it's a failing that natural history science isn't somewhere on the school curriculum early to imbue this love of the environment, natural environment, into people. because everyone's so busy later on in doing work, just getting money to exist, etc. And there's a whole. I've seen so much of the Australian environment that I couldn't. It'd take me a year to explain it all.
I suppose you're right. I think people like me who aren't literate in that world, I think for us it's like going into a country where you don't speak any of the language at all, and there's this stuff going on, and new things are being said and understood, and dramas are being played out, and there's no way into it apart from the kind of body language or something. That's it. And if you understand the language, and you've learnt the language early on, then you can appreciate the full drama of the lives that are going around.
People like David Attenborough, for example, has been a key person in bringing that type of world to the general public, and especially without the new photographic techniques, etc. So we can show people, there's something going on out there that, you mightn't think is important, but these are very important events in the existence of humankind.
When did you get the idea you wanted to work in a museum?
Well, that boy across the road, Graham Wells, was also involved in a butterfly banding project running out of the Australia Museum at the time. By the way, I was brought up in Bankstown, Greenacre. That's the setting. And I thought, wow, wouldn't that be really neat to work in a museum just amongst natural history specimens, Had
you been to a museum?
No, my parents really weren't into that type of thing. Mum was a seamstress. Dad was a glass worker, just real hard workers.
Were they migrants?
Migrants, came here after the war. And I was actually conceived overseas and born here, and
so they arrived here. Lived through a war or something. They arrive here and they go
with one crate of belongings.
And there's their son who's absorbed and caught up in the beauty of the natural world, and they must have thought, oh, why isn't he running a business? Why, it's all.
Well, my brother does. He's an architect in Sydney.
So, what was it about snails that made you think, wow, great, rather than ugh?
Well, when I first got my first little position at the Australia Museum, I applied actually to work on very tiny crustaceans in algal washings from Macquarie Island, but I never ended up getting that job. But I got a position actually sorting their freshwater snail collection for a curator then, Dr. Winston Ponder. And that went on for 6 months, and then we got money to actually curate their entire Australian land snail collection to a standard which would enable it to be digitally databased. And the idea was we would network all the museum's databases together. Well, that went on for 18 months. But during that 18 months, because they got such a magnificent collection down there, I just got a grounding not only in Australian species, but worldwide. Their worldwide collection is just amazing. I mean, I never knew snails from onions previous to that period. But I knew that I wanted to work on some animal group. And the fact that there were so many, going back a bit, when I got the position at the Queensland Museum, I came from the Australian Museum with some sort of idea of what the Queensland snail fauna was like. And I went out collecting on a trip with my assistant then, Alison Green, for 2 weeks between Gympie and Rockhampton. We collected 13,000 specimens, and of about 100.
13,000?
Yeah. Most of these are collected on shell, which is one of the good things you can do with snails. You don't have to collect a lot of live stuff, so we're not talking about trashing the snail fauna of South East Queensland. Right. We collected 13,000 specimens, and I can only put names to of the 130 species that I identified.
So there was this great big undiscovered world, in other words.
And I suddenly thought, wow, and I just saw the complexity in the diversity of the group, and every field trip just added to this thing, so that we increased the collections of the Queensland Museum from 10,000 odd specimens to 200,000 over that 25-year period.
So what do those field trips in the early days entail?
Well, basically, you've just asked, does the museum have money for us to go on a field trip, because you got a per diem and you got your motels paid for, or camping allowance, because we camped a lot.
Right, so you're camping out most of the time.
Yeah.
But given that most snails, they're nocturnal, aren't they, by and large?
They are nocturnal, but early on I realised I didn't want to collect at night.
Why?
Mainly because the things I was collecting, which are the really tiny pinwheel snails, are hard enough to see during daylight, let alone during the evening. And when we collect, we cover a large area in a rainforest. It might be 100 metres by 100 metres over a couple of hours. And to wander through that type of country at night time is, I mean, apart from falling over logs and tangling your throat around vines, there's all those other bitey things that come out at night.
Like spiders. How do you feel about spiders?
Well, I've sort of got used to them, but they are still the thing. I don't worry about snakes as much as I worry about spiders, because they're very little legs, although my face doesn't appeal to me.
No, as you put it like that, I think I'd go snail spiders, I don't know. So when you're out there looking for snails, where do you find them? How do you find them?
Most snails live under logs, or under rocks, under any type of forest debris, actually, in shelter. And we just go about turning over huge amounts of thing. And by the way, putting the logs back if we can. Sometimes you just turn the logs and they're just too big to roll back. But we always make the point of turning the log towards us. This is very important. I always stress it to the kids. Always turn the log towards you. So if there is something nasty on the other side of the log, you'll let the log between you and them.
What kind of things have come out from under logs that you weren't expecting in the past?
Yeah. We were up on the Normanby River up in North Queensland, camped on the riverbank, and it was basically a sandy environment. And I knew there were species of snails that inhabited that type of country. And I suppose I'm like a bird watcher. You always want to collect species that you haven't collected, even if they've been described. So I was looking for this thing called Zykelix fosteriana, and I started raking because they bury themselves amongst the sand. And I found a couple of shells, and I turned over this log and started raking, and all of a sudden there's all these live specimens. And then also under this log comes out crawling this native tarantula.
How big was it?
About the size of the palm of your hand.
Oh, God.
But big furry legs. And they call it a barking spider because it actually it stridulates and it rubs its back feet against its abdomen and makes this. So you actually hear them before you see them. But they're really neat because they're dark grey and they have really black sort of their joints are black and they just look. Anyway,
so what did you do once this giant barking tarantula?
The containers I usually put snails in weren't big enough to accommodate this spider, because I knew Robert Raven, our curator of spiders, was keen on these groups. So every time I come across one, I'd collect one. And so I ran back to the car and I got a much larger container and I'm trying to get this thing into the container, which I finally did. And then I thought I'd turn over the other log because there might be more snails. And lo and behold, there's a big taipan.
It's the deadliest snake in the world.
Well, yeah. And just as well it was winter time because it was fairly in a sort of state of torpor. But it was enough to disturb it, and it did the cobra thing, like raised its top part of its body and flared its neck. And I was standing there, and already I didn't have hold of the log, so I couldn't let go, roll it back. It was already rolled over, and I froze, and I was thinking, people say, always stand very still, and the snake won't bite you. And after about 30 seconds, it just seemed like an hour, actually, the snake sort of went back down and crawled away into this high grass. It was about 1 metre high, this grass that I was walking through, and I only had shorts and runners on because that's all I wear when I go into the scrub. I don't sort of dress up in long trousers and hiking boots. I just like to move around really quickly. And the adrenaline rush was so bad I had to sit down for an hour just to get my body to calm down. But that's the closest I've come. And I must say, in all the years I've been collecting and the hundreds of thousands of logs I've rolled and rocks I've rolled, I've seen about half a dozen snakes. But that's the closest I've ever come to a true and close encounter.
I do have to ask, John, when you are in that situation and a taipan has reared up like that in front of you, the world's deadliest snake, and you know you've been told keep very, very still. Is it hard to listen to that voice that's telling you to keep very, very still when everything about you is telling you to leg it out of there as quickly as possible?
And apart from the fact that you're shaking, yeah. But there's little you can do. I mean, because where we were was just out in the middle of nowhere. If it had gone for me, I hate to think what would have happened.
I suppose one of the lovely things about being a snail scientist is that once you do turn over that log, whatever else is scurrying away, the snail's not going anywhere in a hurry, is it?
That's right. And a lot of times the really tiny things I collect are in the crevices underneath logs. So you actually roll a log over and wait for the snails to crawl out and try and get away from the light. And that's one of the things collecting during the day. If you know where snails live, you can collect them during the day. There's no worries. I mean, we've proven that. And I was once invited to go on a nighttime collecting trip after rain. And all I succeeded in doing was getting very wet, very cold, with very few snails. And that sort of cured me of nighttime collecting at all.
Do you ever run into anyone who say, "What are you doing out here?" And you go, "Well, as it happens."
Yes, actually, when you're on a lot of properties, because in the early days we didn't sort of make a point of going around the property owner, because you just don't know in the vast landscapes who owns what property. If you see a patch of scrub, you just leap the fence and go and do your collecting bit and then jump back over the fence again. And we've been sprung a couple of times.
Been shot at?
Well, a lot of people don't want you because they think you're exploring their land for, say, rocks and minerals, for example. And geologists have a really bad history because what are you doing? I'm studying the geology. Oh, yeah, who for? And people don't want their property taken over by mining companies and the rest of it. And the worst one, we were up at a place called Bramwell Station. And we met the property owner driving into his property. He was coming out and he said, "Where are you going?" I said, we just wanted to collect the piece of scrub. "I wouldn't if I were you. We shoot people."
Yeah, I'm here to collect snails. A likely story.
Exactly. We always carry a bag of snails with us. Just show them. Have a look. Have a look.
Tell me about the road you once took when you went looking for snails near Singleton in New South Wales. Things went horribly wrong there.
Oh, yeah, Mount Coracudgee. We wanted to get to this top of this Mount Coracudgee, which is in the sandstone country in the Wollamai National Park, because it has actually a volcanic cap on it and rainforest, and which is scattered amongst a huge complex of sclerophyll dry forest. And I knew there would be snails up there. So you can get in it from the east or the west, as the map showed. We were operating off a topographic map, showed a road almost right up to the top. And anyway, so we started going along this road, and the road got narrower and narrower to a point where almost the right-hand side of the vehicle was off the road when we're driving on two wheels. But then the road opened up again, and that was good. And I thought, well, we're on the right road now. And everything seemed to follow the map. And all of a sudden, we're going up this rock boulder-strewn incline. And we're going up and up and up. I'm just saying, look, this has got to lead somewhere. And you wouldn't believe it. This huge storm came up over the hill, and it dumped the massive amount of water. And as I'm driving up, I said to my partner, "You know where we are? We're halfway up a waterfall," which was a dry waterfall at the stage. So I had to quickly turn the car around.
What are this cascading water?
Yeah, I turned the car around on a sixpence basically, and I just let a free wheel down the rock incline with my hands loosely around the steering wheel, because I couldn't take the time to actually go rock over rock over rock. So and as a result, I ended up breaking the front suspension. But that was the least of my worries at that stage, because I just very close to disaster.
I've left the best, if that's the word for it, a bit till last, which is snail reproduction. I remember being out with friends somewhere near Byron Bay once, and my memory of this is that two slugs descended on a kind of tendril of something, and began to mate with each other, and they were writhing around. It was like watching aliens have sex. It was revolting beyond belief. And so compelling that what was happening was they were writhing, and then something came out of one of them, which I don't know, it was genitalia, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And then it went on, and this went on for an hour. And so people were going, watching it and running away, and then coming back to watch a bit more, and then getting freaked out and running away and coming back to watch a bit more of this slug sex going on. How do they court each other beforehand?
Well, they do. There's a lot of foreplay, and they go and they touch a lot of touching. And actually, a lot of snails have what's called the rosette, which is a group of cells in between the top pair of tentacles, which everts, comes out when they get sexually excited.
Yes.
Okay, and each feels the other's rosette, etc. But the mating can take, pre-mating can take half an hour. and then they finally decide to mate. But what you were talking about are the introduced leopard slugs, and they have this really unusual behaviour where they chase each other around, or a pair, and don't forget they're hermaphrodites, so they're both male and female, on the ground. Then one climbs the tree, the other one follows it up. One then secretes a mucus string and dangles itself off the mucus string. The other one climbs down the mucus string to meet the ones that secreted the mucus.
That's exactly what I saw.
And then they extrude their genitalia, and they exchange sperm. Basically, the penis then inserts into the other's vagina, and so with the other.
So they both have penises and vaginas, and then they mutually impregnate.
The snail reproductive system is basically a series of tubules, but the male tubule everts like the fingers of a glove, for example, and it has very distinctive sculpture on it, depending on what species it is, and then that's inserted into the female part of the reproductive system of the other snail. They go through the mating ritual. One then has to decide to take the plunge and drop to the ground, and the other one then
shoots up the tendril.
Yeah.
So that's leopard slugs. What about snails then? Australian
It's
snails?
basically on the ground mating, but they mate head to head because the genital opening is below the top tentacle, just below the top tentacle, so they mate head to head.
Right under their eye, in other words.
Well, their eye's on the end of a stalk. But and it brings new meaning to that that line, darling, I've got a headache tonight.
So it's essentially, it's what we would recognise as kissing, really, but you get knocked up at the end of the process. And they can impregnate each other at the same time. So is that the way it goes? Is it normally one impregnates the other, or is it normal for them to impregnate each other?
Yep, cross-fertilise. But don't forget, the sperm are secreted in a packet, which is well made out of chitin, and that packet has to come down the male system. So mating can take a long time because that is forced down just by muscular contraction, very slowly out, then into the other snail, and so they can be joined together for a couple of hours.
Hours. Everything they do seems to take a long time then.
Slow and steady.
How long do they live for if they're going to take all this time to move and have sex? Do they have long lifespans?
We estimate between 5 and 15 years.
15 years, as long as that.
Well, they estimate that those ones I was talking about earlier in the Sonora Desert that esturbate for 10 years at a time, they could have a lifespan of 50 years. Is it true that some of them use love darts during their sex? They do, and the introduced garden snail is one such species, and it's confined to a couple of groups of snails. None of our native species have love darts, but that they do, and they actually sort of
jab each other
and stimulate. You know, it's like I don't know what
sadomasochism or something of the kind, is it?
The human equivalent would be.
I wonder. And then what happens after they've been impregnated? How do they then go on to actually have the eggs?
Then the eggs are fertilised because the sperm actually, that packet gets, the outer lining gets digested, then the sperm move up the reproductive tract to the fertilisation chamber, which the eggs come down from the albumin gland, the egg is fertilised, then the eggs are laid. And they usually laid under logs in a depression in the ground. It might be up to 20 eggs.
Could they self-impregnate?
Well, that has been recorded for some small snails, but it wouldn't be the rule.
No, because it makes no sense, because you need biodiversity, don't you?
That begs the question, do you need one snail to establish a colony? So the jury's still out with a lot of it. Right, it's the chicken and the egg all in the same place. Well, who's got the time to sit there and watch? Yes, there's only so many hours in the day, aren't there? Fascinating to talk to you, John. I love talking about snails. I had no idea. That's extraordinary. And we'll have photos of those snails you brought in on our Facebook page and these beautiful shells as well. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, John, and thank you so much. Thank you, Richard.
This is Conversations with Richard Feidler on ABC Radio.
Dr. John Stanisic, a.k.a. the Snail Whisperer, is the lead author of Australian Land Snails Volume 1. And I recorded that conversation with John back in 2014. When we checked in with him, he let us know that the second volume is just going to press. abc.net.au/conversations. I'm Richard Feidler.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.